Welcome to Behind the Charities. Today I'm speaking with Lorcan Kenny, Head of Research at Autistica. Hi, Lorcan.
Hi there.
Hi, could you tell us a bit about Autistica and what you do as Head of Research?
Sure. So Autistica is the UK's national research charity. It was founded in 2014 by Dame Stephanie Shirley, and it was set up really because there was lots of initiatives and charities and activity around providing services for autistic people, but there really wasn't anything there in terms of furthering the research and evidence base that's needed. So the role that I have at Autistica is Head of Research, which is two things really. It's heading up all of our research grant activity, so from deciding what we're going to want to give funding to in a particular year, supporting our scientific review panel to make decisions about whether something is fundable or not, including autistic people and other community members in the process of making decisions about how we fund grants. And then the other side of it is we have a research network, which is making it easy and possible for people to find opportunities to take part in research, and also for researchers to find the right people to take part in studies. And as well as finding people to take part, it's also about making it possible for people to be involved in the research process. So if a researcher wants to work with an autistic person or a parent or a professional to design a research project or to test if the idea that they think is a good idea is actually of interest to the community, those kinds of things, we do lots of work to facilitate kind of involvement of community members in those ways.
And what brought you to Autistica? When did you start at Autistica?
So I joined just over 2 years ago. Well, I've been saying 2 years ago for a while now, it's probably slightly longer. And I came because I was an autism researcher myself first. So I did a PhD in autism research and knew of Autistica as a funder in the UK that was doing a good bit more than just funding research. So that's kind of what drew me first. The opportunity was to work on our research network, which is something that I was really interested in. So before doing my PhD, I worked at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education at UCL. And in my role there was kind of working across lots of projects. So my kind of interests in autism research are quite broad. So normally kind of researchers, they research their topic and then they get interested in a narrower field. And whereas I was actually really interested in the time that I spent working on lots of things, where actually I was kind of, going from doing qualitative interview studies with people in particular types of, for example, residential special schools, through to doing cognitive testing in the lab with people kind of testing, theories about autism. And I kind of enjoyed having that breadth. And the lab that I worked in, Cray at UCL, was really keen on including the community in the research that they do. So the approach that they were taking was really pushing the research field in the UK to kind of do better at asking the kind of questions that the community care about, but also kind of in the way that you go about doing research. So making sure that it's accessible, that it's acceptable to people, that you're talking about autistic people in a way that's sensitive, that's respectful, and all of these kinds of things, which really aligned really, really well with the way Autistica do things. So when I saw this opportunity kind of at the end of my PhD to work in an organization that kind of really mapped well onto the ethos of the way of doing research at Cray, it seemed like a perfect fit for me to kind of build on those bits in terms of pushing the field to do research a bit differently than maybe they have historically been doing it, to kind of ask those questions that people really care about, that have the chance to kind of change lives.
And you have obviously previously mentioned that you're on secondment at the moment. I was wondering if you could explain to us a typical day prior to that, and also what it looks like now that you're on secondment.
So I guess the first thing I would say is there isn't a typical day working in a small charity or smallish charity, because one of the things that I really like about working at Autistica is there's a lot of working in a team and kind of everyone supports everyone. So there's not kind of necessarily just these are the jobs that the science team do and these are the jobs the communications team do and we never communicate with each other. Actually, there's a lot of things that we all do together, and that's really nice because actually you get to bring together the different kind of sets of skills that, kind of sometimes there are certain things that researchers are really good at and sometimes certain communications professionals are really good at, and there are certain things that policy or fundraising professionals are good at. And in research, you actually don't have that many opportunities to work across those kind of boundaries, whereas working in a charity, you have much more opportunities. So the flip side of that is that any given week might be completely different from the previous one, depending on whether I'm kind of giving more time to working on our kind of a grant round that's falling due. So we need to make a decision about what is going to get funding. And then in the following day, the focus might be preparation for a research conference or event. And then after that, again, it might be kind of, kind of meeting people, giving a presentation about something that we've done previously. I think there's such a wide variety in things that kind of we spend time on. So even within one day, sometimes you can start off the day meeting with a researcher, talking about a really technical aspect of something that we funded that they kind of want to explain to us, to then presenting to a group of professionals kind of about some overarching position that we have about trying to change the use of evidence in practice, through to kind of supporting involvement in a research project where we're facilitating a session with different types of stakeholders to get their views. And then you're kind of at the end of the day, writing governance documents to try and improve the systems that kind of happen in the background that lots of people don't see, to make sure that the decisions that we're making and the processes that we have are being followed and are kind of bringing us to the right kind of decisions and conclusions as much as we want them to.
You mentioned your team. I know Autistica has a relatively small team. Could you tell us a little bit about your team and what they're like?
Yeah, I think people often ask me, what's the best thing about working in charity? And I would say the people is always the answer there, because the team at Autistica are all so committed to doing the same thing, which is improving autistic people's lives. And actually, that's not that common in work life. I think often in work life, the people, depending on their job and their role and their description, are really committed to doing something, but it's not always the same shared goal. And that's what's really nice about working in a charity like Autistica. Everyone that's there wants to achieve the same thing. The individual thing that they might do might be to fundraise money or work in communications, but actually ultimately the goal that everyone has is the same. So it is a reasonably small team. There's at the moment probably about 20 of us, and so there's quite a variety in terms of the backgrounds everyone comes from. Some people are researchers, some people kind of work in policy. There's quite a lot of members on our team who are autistic or have other forms of neurodevelopmental conditions, for example. So that's a really nice part of working in Autistica, that you don't always feel like we must go and do formal consultation with the group. Is actually sometimes even within the team, the kinds of input and ideas that you're getting is coming from people who have multiple sets of experience. Someone might kind of say, as a researcher, I think this, but as a parent, I also think slightly differently about this topic. Or somebody might be able to say, as an autistic person, my view on this might be slightly different. And you can bring out all of these different ideas within the team. And then also kind of, I think it's important for us to kind of sometimes remember that the people who work in the team might not be giving us kind of the same, because they're always employees. So it's not going to be the same as if you go and do a formal consultation with the community. So it's important that we do both, that kind of we have people who have these multiple skill sets that they bring together, but also that doesn't kind of mean we don't also go and consult with the community to find out how best to make some of these decisions.
Yeah, and you mentioned that. I know Autistica is very good at ensuring that you consult the autistic community. I was just wondering how you do that with the research that you fund.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different stages to it, I guess. And one part is identifying what are the priority questions. So for people who might not know the history of autism research so much, there hasn't always been a very close match between where research funding has been allocated and the types of questions that the community are particularly interested in being addressed. So for example, a lot of funding has historically been spent on things like how we might be able to find a cure for autism maybe someday, or whether we should be investigating the biology of prenatal autism to be able to potentially detect whether somebody is autistic before birth. And actually, if you ask autistic people, their parents and family members, there is a overwhelming interest in research that tells us about how we design services that make autistic people who are alive today happier, healthier, and live longer. And the funding allocation to those kinds of questions actually has been really quite small, which is where Autistica has been kind of trying to change things quite dramatically. So there's a lot of things that we've done in terms of research prioritization. So we've done a James Lind Alliance, which is a process that we did with the James Lind Alliance, funded by the NIHR, to consult the community on what are their top 10 questions. And a lot of the then policies and strategies that we've written at Autistica have been kind of based on that. So kind of saying our funding for this particular year or period of time, must be something that comes from a set of priorities, which means that, there will be certain researchers out there who might have previously got funding who no longer are eligible for funding, but that is kind of part of doing things this way. I think you have to say, we're only funding things that are community priorities. It's not so good if you can kind of say, we've come up with these top 10 questions, but we'll still allow applications from outside of that. But of course, sometimes there needs to be some exceptions as well, because sometimes there are things that come to light after you do community consultation like that becomes a community priority, and things change over time. So it's not a question either of saying, okay, we've done that once, we know the community priorities, let's just kind of keep going with that forever. Actually, it's about checking in and updating on that. Something else we do on kind of identifying research questions is we run summits on particular topics. So we've done some in the past, for example, on adult social care, on physical health and aging, on autism and epilepsy. And they're where we bring together autistic people, parents, professionals, and researchers kind of at multiple stages in their career, sometimes with some other commissioners, for example, or funding agencies. And we come up with questions that are really the most pressing questions that those collaborative groups come up with together. So the idea there is that you're shaping things up with people who kind of know how to word something into a research question, but also people at the same table who know whether that research question is likely to have any bearing on someone's day-to-day life. So if we were to be able to answer that question, would it likely bring about a change in people's lives? And I think something about that is it makes researchers in particular have to be really honest with themselves and say, I have this beautifully formed research question that I can think of the perfect research to design and techniques and statistics that I'm going to use. And somebody sitting there at the table next to them is kind of saying, that might be true, but I don't know if the answer to that question is actually going to change my life or people like me. And the researcher sometimes will push back, and that's what's important with these things, is there is that two-way discussion, and people will often find that they end up at a position that's slightly different from where both people in that discussion started. And that's the kind of the really valuable thing for us, is when we can get to that point where people have kind of together come to a point of figuring out what's the priority question. And then within our kind of our different processes for making decisions, it's about building it within, for example, our scientific review panel. We have a couple of people who are coming from a kind of a lived experience perspective, so that they can provide more than one perspective kind of evaluation of an application for funding. In reviewing abstracts for our research festival, we also have we ask researchers to submit a scientific abstract, which gets reviewed by scientists, and a kind of plain English abstract, which then gets reviewed by members of our community. And we ask them slightly different questions. We'll ask the scientists about the methods used and how robust the study is, and then we'll ask the community whether they're addressing a question that is in fact a community priority, if the way that they're communicating about autistic people, for example, is sensitive and respectful.
That's really interesting. I wondered if you could explain for people who aren't familiar with autism, what is autism and how does it impact people's lives?
So this is a surprisingly complicated question to answer, actually, because I think the way in which research has thought about what autism is a little bit sometimes at odds with the way that the community or autistic people describe it themselves. Even down to the language that we use to talk about autism sometimes creates this divide between the research community and the community of autistic people. Research has tended to take, this is a definition of autism that exists in a psychiatric diagnostic manual, which is very based on a person has set deficits, to use their language, communication, interaction, they have difficulties, for example, with rigid and repetitive behaviors and thoughts. And the consequence is that when you describe it in those ways, you set up an expectation that the research is about finding, solutions to people's impairments and deficits. But a lot of autistic people within the community talk about autism as a part of their identity, in the same way that for some people, ethnicity or nationality or gender or sexuality could all be components of somebody's identity. And they come with things in life being made sometimes easier, sometimes harder, based on different components of your identity. And so that kind of creates this mismatch between the way in which research is conducted, if the people conducting the research are trying to find ways to kind of, treat an impairment, versus support people who may not be achieving as a group the best outcomes. So we know, for example, autistic people die on average younger. We know that they're more likely to have mental health issues, lower quality of life. We know they're more likely too to have lots of physical health conditions. So, there is a need for research to find evidence-based ways to support people to make all of these things better for the autistic community. But that requires us kind of doing this in a way that respects the fact that maybe autistic people don't necessarily use the same ways of talking about autism or defining autism as the diagnostic manuals that clinicians use to give somebody a diagnosis.
I thought that was really beautifully put. I mean, language is so important when it comes to these things, and this is one of the things I love about Autistica is you are constantly consulting that community to ensure that you're communicating about autism in the way that they're comfortable with. And I don't think you can underestimate how important that will be to that community. What are you most proud of when it comes to the work that Autistica has done?
I'm most proud, I think, of the way in which we get conversations started on topics that sometimes haven't received as much attention in the past as they should have. So we see ourselves as quite well placed as a small organization to kind of kickstart a new area of interest or a new way of doing things. We're quite willing to kind of try something and let everyone know it's our first time doing something, and if it doesn't work, at least we tried. So I think there's lots of things that we do in terms of the summits that I talked about earlier, where it's a way in which we pick a topic and say that we need more action on this. We could fund a project, or we could use our role as Autistica to get people together, to convene a conversation, to start building momentum, to try and include some other organizations in that process, so that as well as Autistica being responsible for getting that conversation started, we pull in other organizations and say, we're going to start working on this. We'd love for you to come and join the process here. Researchers then hopefully will start working with people on some of the questions that people are starting to raise through these processes. And sometimes they will come and submit applications to Autistica. Sometimes they'll come and they'll ask Autistica to work with them on applications to other funders, typically if they want to apply for funding for a project that might be much bigger than what Autistica would fund. So they might be interested in doing a fully powered randomized control trial or something, which is not typically the kind of thing that we would fund at Autistica, but we would be very proud of the fact that we got something started. So we kind of created a space for somebody to start a conversation on a topic and hopefully create some momentum, support them to build that momentum over time.
That's lovely. Another slightly tricky question, so if you need time, don't worry. If you had one wish for your charity, what would it be?
If I had one wish, I think it would be that the supports that autistic people have the right to receive are evidence-based, which sounds quite simple, and I think kind of needs to come with the explanation that many of the supports that are currently provided are actually not based on any evidence at all, or they're based on really poor quality evidence. So one of the things that we're really working hard on is saying that we know that the outcomes that autistic people face are not acceptable right now, and we're trying to change those. And that's a big long-term ambition. In the meantime, to get towards that ambition, we're trying to make it so that the kinds of supports that people are offered now, today, tomorrow, are evidence-based as much as possible. But when they're not, that's communicated really transparently with people, because it's the case for so many different conditions that actually, when you go to see a professional and you ask for help, that they would tell you that actually we don't know. The honest truth is we don't know how best to help you. But what we can do is we can offer you the opportunity to take part in research. It is obviously your choice to consent to be involved in this research or not. But if people are told openly and transparently that we don't know how best to help you right now, but you can be involved in helping us figure out how best to help people like you in future, then that's doing two things. It's making sure that people know the role that research plays in changing the state of play for them being told that we don't know how to help you. So that does two things. It for the person who's asking for support, it means that it's communicated to them very clearly that the evidence doesn't yet exist to tell us how to help them. So they know that what they're doing may or may not work. So that's communication to them clearly. But the second thing that it does is it means that the activity that they're involved in is not just kind of what somebody is trying in the hope that it works. It's actually being systematically evaluated, so that at best we'll find out that it works, can demonstrate that it works, and the next generation of autistic people are going to be offered evidence-based support. But at worst, it doesn't work, but at least we know it doesn't work, and we're still building to that evidence base. So that's kind of the work that we're doing with NHS England and at Autistica, to try and make sure that it becomes much more common practice that is part of kind of day-to-day clinical practice, but also other forms of professional supports, whether it's education or healthcare or other public supports, that it becomes the norm to be open that there's a lot we don't know about how to improve autistic people's lives, and that we are working to try and fill those gaps so that we reduce the uncertainty that is there when clinicians have to make decisions on the basis of clinical judgment alone. There's obviously always a role for clinical judgment, but we're just trying to kind of reduce that uncertainty that people have to use to make decisions about people's lives.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Lorcan. I think you've answered all of my questions. So I just want to thank you for your time, and good luck with your work with NHS England.
Thank you.